My son didn't look at me when he said it. That was the part I couldn't shake afterward. Not the words themselves. Not even the laughter that followed. It was the fact that he kept his eyes on the room while he said it, like I was a detail he didn't need to face directly. "Dad, why don't you sit over here? You know how you get confused at these things." He gestured toward a small folding chair pushed against the wall near the service entrance. A cart of dirty dishes sat beside it. The catering staff had been stacking used plates there all evening. The smell of leftover food hung in the air. The room was full of people, my daughter-in-law's family, business associates, a few local politicians who had made the drive from Columbus. Everyone dressed sharp, everyone smiling, everyone celebrating my son Daniel's appointment as regional director of one of the largest logistics companies in the Midwest, and everyone heard what he said. I stood there for a moment. 63 years old, 31 years of service to the United States Army behind me. I had given orders in places most people in that room couldn't find on a map. I had buried friends. I had written letters to mothers explaining how their sons had died with honor. I sat down next to the dirty dishes, not because I was confused, not because I was weak, because I had spent a lifetime choosing my battles carefully, and because something told me this one wasn't over yet. But before I tell you what happened that night, I need to tell you how we got there, because that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for most of my adult life, one small dismissal at a time. My name is Robert Gaines. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 3 children. My father worked at a factory and my mother cleaned houses. Neither of them finished high school. We didn't have much, but we had structure, and we had pride. My father believed in showing up, in doing the job right, in keeping your word even when it cost you something. I enlisted in the Army at 18, not because I had nowhere else to go, because I believed in something larger than myself, because I wanted to earn a life with my hands and my discipline, rather than inherit one. My wife Margaret understood that about me from the beginning. We met during my 2nd year of service, married young, and built our lives around my deployments and her patience. She was the steady one, the one who held the house together when I was overseas, who raised our 2 sons without complaint, who never once made me feel guilty for the years I spent away. Daniel was our first. Smart, charismatic, always the one who knew how to work a room. He had my father's confidence and his mother's charm, and he used both without ever quite appreciating either. Our 2nd son, Thomas, was quieter, more internal. He went into medicine, which suited him. He asked questions before he spoke. He listened longer than most people were comfortable with. The dynamic between Daniel and me started shifting when he was in college. He had grown into a young man who valued appearances, who measured success in square footage and LinkedIn connections. He was not cruel by nature, but he had developed a particular blindness toward anything that didn't fit the image he was building for himself. An old Army veteran father with calloused hands and a pension didn't fit that image. He never said it directly. He didn't need to. It showed in small ways. The way he changed the subject when his colleagues asked about my background. The way he referred to my service as when Dad was in the military, the same way you'd say when Dad had that job at the hardware store. The way he stopped asking about my life somewhere around his 30th birthday and never quite started again. Margaret noticed. She brought it up once, gently, the way she did everything. I told her I wasn't concerned. That was only half true. I retired from the Army as a full colonel after 31 years. The retirement ceremony was quiet and meaningful and attended by people who understood what the years had cost. Margaret cried. Thomas flew in from Denver and stood beside me the entire afternoon. Daniel sent a card. He was in the middle of an important deal, he said. He hoped I understood. I did. But understanding something and being unaffected by it are 2 different things. Margaret passed away 14 months before Daniel's appointment ceremony. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and unforgiving. She was gone within 4 months of the diagnosis. After she died, something in our family quietly rearranged itself. Thomas called every few days. He drove down from Denver twice in the first year just to sit with me. He never asked if I was fine. He just showed up, which was its own kind of answer. Daniel called on holidays. He was busy. He always had been. When the invitation to Daniel's appointment celebration arrived in my mailbox, I held it for a long time before opening it. The event was being held at the Harrington Club in Columbus, a private venue, the kind that has a dress code posted by the entrance and a waiting list for membership. Daniel had recently joined. I considered not going. Thomas had actually suggested it. Not to be cruel, but practically. You know how these things go, Dad. His crowd. I went anyway. Because he was still my son. Because Margaret would have wanted me to try. And because some part of me, the part that never fully learned its lesson, was still hoping. The Harrington Club was everything I expected. Dark wood paneling, crystal glasses, the quiet murmur of people who believed their comfort was a form of sophistication. I wore my best suit. I had polished my shoes the night before the way my sergeant had taught me 40 years ago. When I arrived, Daniel was across the room deep in conversation with a man in an expensive watch. He noticed me, gave a brief wave, and went back to his conversation. I found the seating chart near the entrance. My name wasn't on it. I checked again. Nothing. I stood near the back for a few minutes, trying to determine if I had missed something. Then Daniel appeared at my shoulder. Dad, why don't you sit over here? You know how you get confused at these things. The folding chair. The cart of dirty dishes. The service entrance. I sat down. For a while, no one paid me much attention. Servers moved around me with trays. A few people glanced in my direction with that particular expression people use when they've witnessed something uncomfortable and decided it isn't their business. Daniel returned to the center of the room where he belonged. His father-in-law, Gerald, caught my eye from across the room. He was a decent man, Gerald. He had always been polite to me. For a moment I thought he might come over. Then someone called his name, and he turned away. I folded my hands and looked toward the windows. Outside, the Columbus skyline was beginning to light up against the darkening sky. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the last time I had been in a room full of strangers and felt completely alone. It had been a different country and a different kind of danger, but the feeling had a familiar shape. I was still looking at the skyline when the front doors opened. I noticed the shift in the room before I saw who had entered. Conversations paused, heads turned. The maitre d' moved toward the entrance faster than I had seen him move all evening. 2 men in dark suits entered first. Then a third man followed, and the room reacted the way rooms do when someone with real weight walks in. He was in his early 70s. Silver hair, a bearing that some people are born with, and others spend careers trying to acquire. He wore civilian clothes, but they didn't hide what he was. You don't spend 3 decades learning to read men and forget how. I knew who he was before anyone said his name. General Arthur Whitfield, retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the kind of man whose name appears in history books that haven't been written yet. Daniel straightened immediately. Several people near him did the same. A murmur moved through the room. My son, to his credit, had the presence of mind not to look too eager. I watched from my chair beside the dirty dishes, because unlike everyone else in that room, I understood exactly why Arthur Whitfield was here. And I knew the evening was about to change in ways nobody present was prepared for. The general's eyes moved across the room the way experienced people scan a space. Methodical, unhurried. The kind of attention that misses nothing. Then he found me. He stopped moving. For a moment we simply looked at each other across the length of the room. 26 years collapsed in about 3 seconds. Then Arthur Whitfield started walking toward me. Not toward the stage. Not toward the man of the hour, toward the folding chair by the service entrance. I rose to my feet. The room noticed. Conversations dropped away like lights going out one by one. People turned to follow the general's path, and their expressions shifted as they realized where he was heading. He crossed the room without hesitating. When he reached me, he extended his hand, and his grip was exactly what I remembered. "Bob Gaines," he said. "Somebody put you next to a dish cart." It wasn't a question. "Arthur," I said. "It's been a while." He looked at the cart, then at the folding chair, then back at me. His jaw tightened slightly. "Yes," he said, "it has." The room was completely silent. Daniel had gone pale. The general turned to a nearby staff member. "I'd like a proper table set for Colonel Gaines, please. As close to the front as you have." He didn't say it with anger. He said it the way men say things when they are entirely certain they will be obeyed. The staff moved immediately. The speed alone said something.
Daniel stepped forward carefully.
General Whitfield, sir. I'm Daniel Gaines. This is my event. I want to welcome you and— I know whose event it is, the general said. He shook my son's hand without warmth. Congratulations on the appointment. Thank you, sir. Daniel was recalibrating in real time. I could see it. I didn't realize you knew my father. Arthur looked at him for a moment before answering. Your father and I served together in 3 countries over 8 years. He saved my life once, and the lives of 11 other men on a night I don't discuss at parties. He paused. I didn't realize you knew your father. Daniel said nothing. A new table had materialized near the front of the room, a proper chair, a proper setting. One of the club's staff guided me toward it almost apologetically. Arthur sat beside me, not at the head table. Not in the VIP arrangement that had been prepared for him somewhere near the stage. Beside me, I heard someone behind us whisper, "Who is he?" A woman nearby answered quietly, "His name is on the building at Fort Benning." The room reformed itself around this new information. People who had looked past me all evening were now looking at me directly, with the panicked recalibration of people who have made an obvious and public mistake. Daniel's father-in-law, Gerald, walked over. His expression had changed considerably. "Bob," he said, "I should have come over earlier. I apologize for that." I told him it was fine. He didn't look like he believed me, which was appropriate. A few minutes later, a woman I didn't recognize approached our table. She was perhaps 50, professional bearing, the kind of composed that comes from years of managing difficult situations. "Colonel Gaines," she said. "I'm Susan Park. I'm writing the regional profile on General Whitfield for the Tribune. I had no idea you'd be here tonight." She glanced at my original chair, still sitting beside the dish cart. "May I ask how long have you known each other?" "Long enough," Arthur said pleasantly, before I could answer. She smiled and stepped back. The murmur in the room had changed quality. Earlier it had been the sound of celebration. Now, it had the particular texture of people quietly revising their understanding of an evening. My son stood near the stage, trying to look comfortable and failing. Thomas arrived 20 minutes later. He had driven 3 hours from Denver, after finishing a patient consultation, the same way he did everything, without announcing it and without asking for recognition. He found me at the new table, took in the situation in about 4 seconds, and sat down across from Arthur with the calm of a man who is never entirely surprised by anything. "Tom," I said, "Dad." He looked at the general. "Sir." Arthur nodded. "Your father talks about you." "He talks about you too," Thomas said. "Usually when he thinks I'm not paying attention." Arthur laughed. It was the first time I had heard him laugh in 26 years, and it sounded exactly the same. Daniel made his way over eventually. He sat down beside Thomas without being invited. For a while, nobody said much. The ceremony portion of the evening began at the front of the room. Introductions and remarks, and the official announcement of Daniel's new role. Applause, photographs, the usual machinery of public recognition. Throughout it all, Arthur sat beside me and spoke quietly about people we had known and places we had been. He did not perform. He did not make a point of being seen with me. He simply sat there, the way people sit with someone whose company they have genuinely missed. That was, in its way, more powerful than anything he could have done deliberately. When the formal portion ended and the room loosened into conversation again, one of the men from Daniel's company approached our table. Vice president of something, the kind of man who moves toward power the way a compass moves toward north. "General Whitfield," he said, "it's an extraordinary honor. I have to ask, what brings you to Columbus tonight?" Arthur looked at the man evenly. "I heard Bob Gaines was going to be in town." The man blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Colonel Gaines." Arthur gestured toward me. "We served together at the start of my career. He was the finest officer I worked under in 30 years of service. When I found out he'd be here tonight, I drove up from Cincinnati." He had driven up from Cincinnati. I hadn't known that. I looked at him, and he met my eyes for a moment without expression. But I had learned to read Arthur Whitfield in the dark, in conditions where expression was a luxury. He had known what kind of evening this might be, and he had come anyway. The vice president looked at my son. then back at me, then at his drink, as though it might offer guidance. Daniel had heard every word. He excused himself a few minutes later. I watched him walk toward the back of the room, toward the bar, away from the table. His shoulders had a quality I recognized. The same quality they'd had when he was 11 years old and had broken a window with a baseball and spent 2 hours trying to avoid telling me. He knew. Thomas said nothing. He refilled my water glass and asked Arthur about a deployment in Germany that he had apparently researched in preparation for this conversation, which meant he had known Arthur might be here, which meant the two of them had been in contact. I looked at my younger son. He kept his eyes on the general and said, mildly, "Drink your water, Dad." It took another hour for Daniel to come back to the table. The room had thinned by then. Jackets had come off. The formality of the early evening had softened into something more honest. He sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a while. I waited. "The chair," he finally said. I nodded. He looked down at the tablecloth. "I told myself you'd be fine. That you didn't care about that stuff." He paused. "That wasn't true." "No," I said. "It wasn't." He rubbed the back of his neck. It was such a familiar gesture, one I had watched since he was a child, that it was briefly disorienting to be sitting across from a man of 40 who still did it when he was uncomfortable. "I don't know when I started doing that," he said. "Making you smaller to make myself fit better." I didn't answer, because he wasn't finished. "Mom would have hated tonight," he said. "Your mother," I said carefully, "hated dishonesty more than she hated anything else." He looked up. "She loved you completely," I told him. "She never stopped. But she would have said something to you by now that I haven't." "What?" "That I'm still your father. That the years I spent in places you've never been, doing work you've never had to think about, those years don't become less real because they're inconvenient for the room you're in." The table was quiet for a long moment. Arthur had stepped away to speak with someone near the entrance. Thomas was watching us without appearing to watch us, a skill he had perfected sometime in medical school. Daniel nodded once, slow, the kind of nod that means something. "I know," he said. "I know you know," I told him. "That's what makes it harder." He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. Some truths don't resolve in a single conversation. They just begin. Thomas drove me back to my hotel that night. We didn't talk much. He has always been comfortable with silence in a way his brother never was. At the entrance, he walked me to the door and stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets. "You could have told him off," he said. "Years ago." "Yes. Why didn't you?" I thought about that. Because he's my son. And because being right isn't the same as being useful. Thomas smiled a little. "Mom used to say something like that." "I know, I was listening." I went up to my room and sat by the window for a long time. Columbus at night through glass. Margaret had always liked cities at night. She said they looked more honest after dark, like they'd stopped trying to impress anyone. I thought about Arthur driving up from Cincinnati, about 30 years of history that my son had never thought to ask about a folding chair beside a dish cart and the particular kind of pain that comes not from cruelty but from invisibility. I thought about the man I had been at Daniel's age, whether I had seen my own father clearly, whether I had asked the right questions while I still had the chance. I fell asleep in the chair before I meant to. 3 weeks later, Daniel called. Not on a holiday. Not for a practical reason. He called on a Tuesday afternoon, which was the first time he had done that in longer than I could accurately remember. He said he had been thinking about what I'd said at the Harrington Club. He said he had also called Thomas, who had told him several things about that evening that Daniel hadn't known, including the fact that Thomas had contacted Arthur Whitfield 2 weeks before the event. "He just showed up?" Daniel asked. "He just showed up," I confirmed. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "What did you do together? You and Whitfield, in those 3 countries?" And for the first time in perhaps 20 years, my son asked me a real question, not a polite one, not a transitional one. A question that wanted an actual answer. I told him about Germany first, then about a deployment I hadn't spoken of publicly since my retirement. Not everything. Some things belonged to the men who were there, but enough. Enough for him to understand what the years had contained. He listened for a long time without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Dad, I didn't know any of that. You never asked. Another silence. Longer this time. I'm asking now, he said. Those 3 words cost him something. I could hear it. They were not easy words for a man like Daniel, a man who had spent 2 decades curating the version of himself he showed the world. Asking meant admitting there was something he didn't know. Admitting that meant acknowledging the distance he had allowed to grow between us. But he said them anyway, and that was worth something. Not everything. You can't recover 20 years over a Tuesday phone call. You can't undo a folding chair next to a dish cart with 3 words and a change of tone. But you can begin. And beginning is not nothing. I have learned over 63 years that most of the things that matter in a life are not dramatic. They are not ceremonies or announcements or public reversals. They are small decisions, made quietly, that either compound into something you can live with or don't. The decision to show up, the decision to ask, the decision to sit beside the dirty dishes without letting it break you, because you know who you are regardless of where someone puts your chair. Margaret knew that. She knew it better than I did. I think about her every day. I think about the specific way she would shake her head when I was being stubborn, and the way she never let that stop her from telling me the truth. I think about how she would have sat down in that folding chair right alongside me, not because she accepted the insult, but because she was never confused about what mattered. The people, not the chairs. Daniel and I have talked 4 times since that Tuesday call. Each conversation is slightly less careful than the one before. He asks about my service. He asks about his grandfather, whom he barely knew. He asked me once, without quite looking me in the eye, whether I thought he had turned into someone his mother would have been proud of. I told him the truth. I told him not yet. But that I thought he was working on it. He didn't argue with that. He just said okay. That was enough for one day. If there is something I want you to take from this, it's not about rank or recognition or the satisfaction of being seen by the right people at the right moment. It's simpler than that. Ask the people you love about their lives while you can still hear the answers. Don't wait for a general to walk through the door to understand who is sitting in front of you. The time you spend assuming you already know someone is time you could spend actually knowing them. My father told me once that a man who doesn't know his own history is just a man with good intentions and no direction. I've spent my whole life thinking he meant national history, military history, the kind that gets written down. He meant family. He always meant family. The people who matter most to us are rarely the ones we think to ask about. Robert sat beside a dish cart in his best suit, 31 years of service invisible to the room until someone who truly knew him walked through the door. We don't need a general to validate the people we love. We just need to ask the right question before the room gets too loud to hear the answer. A small note to our viewers. This story was created and imagined by AI, crafted to bring you an entertaining listen and carry a little something worth keeping long after the story ends.